In 1985, the Disney film Return to Oz was released in theaters, and few years later, made on its way to home VHS. I can't remember how old I was at the time I seen it, perhaps 5 years old at most. I knew right away that there was something unusual about the film, something especially disturbing. I remember that the first time I seen it, I cried. I remember watching the film, glued in place in front of the television, not out of involvement, but out of terror. Truth be told, it was a bloody, scary film. Now, before you groan and go on to read something else, don't worry, this isn't a story of a haunted videotape. The film itself played out perfectly normally, as much as possible. Dorothy didn't turn to the camera and start screaming while blood poured out of her eyes or anything stupid like that. I'm not interested in telling you stupid stories like you've heard 100 times before. I just want to tell you how I felt when I watched this video, and some of the strange things that reminded me about. It's a strange story, and I really wonder what quite the producer, Paul Makowski, was thinking at the time. I know that the power behind the film didn't really rest with him. Instead, it rested with the film's director, Walter Murch, a specialist in sound and editing. Murch often worked on editing for films like The Godfather and Apocalypse. Now but Return to Oz was his only venture into directing. I keep thinking that something may have happened to him during the production of this film. Maybe something that put him off directing any films from then onwards. But that's just a guess. My mother got a copy of the film on VHS. I remember distinctively, because she also had a copy of the old Judy Garland musical version. She loved that film. I was somewhat less impressed with it. The separate opening for a child who was used to color television seemed boring to me. I didn't care for the dancing, and the witch didn't impress me. All the sets just looked so false, and I found myself not appreciating the film. My mother, though, loved it. When I was an adult, she told me about Judy Garland's drug addiction and her gradual fall from Hollywood grace, a story that felt equally tragic to anything on the silver screen. Return to Oz, however, wasn't a sequel. In fact, the only thing that connected to the musical version was the presence of the ruby slippers, which were silver in the original book. But my mother was still excited to see it, so she had asked a friend to find her a copy of the film, and we had watched it. The film tells a story about Dorothy's return to the wonderful land of Oz, or at least it should be wonderful, but really isn't. But she's so desperate to go back, and when we first meet her in the film, she was very depressed, miserable, and lonely. The very first image we have in the film is her staring sadly into a dirty mirror. Before long, her family take her to the hospital. At the hospital, which transpires is more than an asylum, Dorothy is introduced to a doctor, keen to try out the newly invented electric healing machine. The doctor introduced Dorothy to it, pointing out the machine's features. Here, he explains, pointing out to the voltage meter, is its mouth in here, he explains, pointing to the switch that sent crackling shocks of electricity searing through the young girl's skull, is his nose. She is escorted down to the bowels of the hospital, through the tall and towering hallways, and locked with a barren, empty cell. That night she is strapped onto a hospital bed, and with the screams of other inmates echo throughout the hospital, and is secured to the electric machine. A storm rages outside, and soon it knocks out the hospital power, during which Dorothy is rescued by another young girl. Together they flee into the river and the banks of the hospital, where they drowned. Dorothy returns to the land of Oz, journeys there in the ruins of an old crate floating down the river. That's the way the story goes. But that's not all that happens. In the old Wizard of Oz film, the one with Judy Garland, Dorothy's house is plucked out of the farm by a hurricane. We all know that hurricanes don't move people from one location to another and drop them gently and carefully down another. If she had been a real person caught in a small wooden farmhouse in the winds of the hurricane, Dorothy would have died, and maybe she did, and all the rest of the film was simply a hallucination within her fevered and frantic brain. No, that's just a theory. In this film, Return to Oz, Dorothy falls into the churning waters of the river, struggling to stay above the surface. Her arms splashing, her mouth gasping for air, and then she's at Oz. And for a few moments, everything seems fine. Everything seems quite happy. She finds a talking chicken named Bellina, who offers to travel with her on the way to Emerald City. Along the way, she finds a tree which distributes lunchboxes filled with ready-made sandwiches. It's almost like everything may turn out all right once they got to the Emerald City, because then she'll be able to get back to her farm. Her farm, where she sat staring into her dirty mirror, her eyes heavy with despair. David Kerr of the Chicago Reader described the film as bleak, creepy, and occasionally terrifying. You don't want Dorothy to go home, not to the world full of doctors who want to rip the happiness from her. From the nurses who tied her down, from the towering hallways and the electric machines with wide grinning mouths. Soon Dorothy finds herself in her old farmhouse, the one she crashed into her previous visit to Oz. It sits in the overgrown forest. No cheery, dancing munchkins to be found here. Only wild vines and twisted trees. Dorothy wipes the dust that has edged its way over to the windows, trying to see inside. Then she finds the yellow brick road, only to realize that it has been uprooted, its bricks broken and shattered, and the land she wanted to get back home to is twisted, nightmarish, and hostile. The old farmhouse I grew up in, a small village in the rural areas of Cornwall. We had farms surrounding the landscape, and I could climb up one of the small, gently sloping hills and look out onto the horizon, only to see fields of wheat as far as it went. That was my Kansas. I think it was late summer when I had found the old farmhouse. I'd gone out to explore, despite my father's instruction to stay in our house garden. I hiked my way over to the old crumbling stone wall that bordered our garden, and made my way into the fields, venturing as far as I could before the sun would set. I avoided the fields with crows, great towering things, and the clouds above gradually began to grow dark and pendulous. I had gone further than I had before, keen to examine all the small copse of trees in the distance that I had never been to before. It was there, down near the foot of the hill. That's where I seen the old farmhouse for the first time. I hurried down the house and ran up to the windows. They were etched with dirt. I could barely see anything through them. I stood up on my tippy toes, trying to look into them, and could only make out a brownish haze. I scrubbed the windows, and soon I was able to make out the inside of the house. It was a disarray, chairs tipped over and tables lying broken in the corner. I could make out a doorway leading into another room, but whatever lay through there was out of sight. It wasn't the same house. The layout was different and the ruins inside it were different. But in and of its own self, the house was almost a perfect fit. It was likely my own version of Dorothy's ruined farmhouse, transported here not far from my house. I wanted to get inside. I don't know why. Perhaps simply because it was there, or perhaps I wanted to get further than Dorothy ever did in the film. I pried the window open and, under the house, the witch lies dead. Crawled inside. It felt warm, as if the air itself was hot. There was a soft hum in the air, which I soon realized it was coming from a few buzzing insects. It felt stuffy, as if the summer heat was magnified and made it heavy. There were no lights, or if there were, the lights would not come on. The room dyed a soft reddish brown from the dust on the windows. I crept across the house, stands up on the witch dead as she rots beneath. Wooden floorboards, and sure enough, they creaked beneath me. I looked into the doorway to the other room, and found that it led to the kitchen. Several items lay in the sink, cutlery and sharp edges. I started to feel sick. I didn't want to be here. The air tasted wrong. There was a smell. There's something I'd never smelt before, but I knew it was bad. I turned to leave and wanted to run, but I heard a heavy sound at the doorway and knew it was footsteps. The figure stood in the doorway. A man stood blocking out the sunlight. He wore a thick, heavy brown coat, and the kind most farmers in the area would wear. His beard was thick and molded like wire wool. His hair hung like dense clumps as he stared at me with eyes, sharp and brutal eyes with utterly intense hatred. He towered above me, a small child about 6 years old, this giant of a figure. He was holding something in his right hand. I couldn't see what, only that it was sharp and pointed and stained with mud. It had to be mud. The man opened his mouth and roared at me, his teeth crooked behind his mane-like beard, releasing every echo of the old broken house with his words. The house is marked with death as it sours from below. The witch was left with her body broken. Get out! I ran. I turned and ran out of the house, charging through the kitchen and pulling myself through the window and out onto the field. I didn't slow down for a second. I tripped and fell into the mud at the base of the window, but I didn't stop. I kept running. I didn't look back. I ran over the field and through the trees. I was gasping for air and my legs hurt, but I didn't stop running, not until I got home. I didn't notice it was dark and that the sun had set, and the dark of the night had covered the village. I slammed the door shut, blocking out the man and the broken farmhouse forever. My father came downstairs when he heard me slam the door and demanded to know where I had been and what I had been doing. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to tell him, so I lied. He demanded to know adherently, telling me that it was late and that he knew I was lying. When I eventually did tell him, he marched me up to my bedroom and ordered me to lower my pants and lay over my bed, where he removed his belt and thrashed my butt until I was screaming and crying rampantly. He made me promise on the threat the same punishment being delivered again, that I would not sneak into people's houses again. I was still sore for most of the day, and I had no idea until years later as to why he had grown so angry with me. When I did find out, it was in my teenage years. Our family moved away from the village into a small house in a large city. The change had been considerable, not just in terms of the building, but the new lifestyle. It became impossible to avoid hearing about the world around us, and I could no longer had my parents' contentious presence to shelter me from the information that you could find on the newspaper or the internet. It was on the evening news, what I had seen on the photograph of a man in the old farmhouse. The reporter explained that he had died in a prison, serving his life sentence for a number of 4 young children, all aged between 4 and 9 years old. He had been arrested a month after my dad taken his belt to me and made me promise not to venture into strangers' houses again. In prison, he committed unalive. The news didn't say how. I later learned that he had broken off a sharp edge of his toothbrush and swallowed it, slicing open his throat. He choked to death on his own blood. Dorothy continued her journey down the broken ruins of Yellow Brick Road. So did I. When Dorothy arrived at the Emerald City, all she finds is her friends, but they have been all turned into stone. They stand around the ruins of the Emerald City, their bodies lifeless. The city is abandoned, only with their bodies left gray and stoic. The Emerald City is a mausoleum, but it's not unoccupied. In one of the most terrifying moments of the film, we meet the living occupants of the city. It tumbles into view, moving on all 4 legs, each leg ending with a screeching rusty wheel. At first we see its face as black and twisted mass of tissue and muscle corrupted into a maniacal grimace, eyes peering out with a cold biting glare. Then it lifts its head up, revealing the previous face was simply a false one. Its true face hiding beneath it laughs. "Come here!" It rasps in a guttural scream. It laughs and laughs. More of them appear. 3, 4, a whole gang. Dorothy flees, and I could clutch my hands to my eyes, hoping to block them out and just make the nightmarish creatures go away. Dorothy finds locked in an old chamber of Emerald City a mechanical guardian called TikTok, who offers to protect her from the wheeled monsters. This creature has its own mechanical face, much like the one from the electric shock machine used back in the hospital in Kansas. But it is Dorothy's friend, and fights off the wheelers, and discovers that the Emerald City has been taken over by an evil witch called Mombi. TikTok isn't terrifying. He's a friendly, as commendable character. The same cannot be said for all of Dorothy's friends, but we'll get to that. First, we need to talk about Mombi. I didn't recognize her as a child when I first watched the film, but Mombi was played by Jean Marsh, who also played the nurse that strapped Dorothy in the hospital bed at the start of the film, and who chased Dorothy into the river to meet her fate. She was, for 5 years, married to John Peters, the actor who famously portrayed the third incarnation of Doctor Who, and perhaps more relevant to this story, played the character of Wurzel Gumridge, a scarecrow who was brought to life. I mention the scarecrow because Dorothy's other companion is a prisoner of Mombi's. When Mombi traps Dorothy in her tower, the young girl from Kansas meets one of Mombi's failed experiments, Jack Pumpkinhead. Jack was a terrifying creature, taller than any adult actor in this film, with the stick-thin limbs which seem to go on forever. It stands unsteadily on elonged legs, wearing the tattered old discolored coat, its fingers ending on long-reaching branches. Atop its neck sits a pumpkin in the place of a head. When the creature moves, so does its sharp and sudden jerks, pulling its hands along if they were alien parts of his body. Its voice was sickly sweet, provided by Brian Henson. Brian Henson is the son of the famous Jim Henson, and is now the chairman of the Jim Henson Company. His voice is certainly one of the softest parts, otherwise terrifying creature. If you ever seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, you might find some very interesting similarities with the film's lead character, and several points throughout the film, Jack's limbs will break and fall apart, having it bound back in place with rope. Dorothy's only way to escape from Mombi's tower is to steal the powder of life, which the witch used to bring the Pumpkinhead creature to life. She stores the powder in the glass cabinet along with her spare heads. Yes, Mombi has a collection of heads. She changes them to fit her mood. They sit in the cabinets, looking for an all-purpose to be asleep, but etched its head very much alive. That night when Dorothy attempts to steal the powder of life from the cabinet, she accidentally awakens one of the disembodied heads. Its eyes snap awake, and a raspy voice screams the girl's name, Dorothy Gale, and the other heads awake and start to scream. They screamed and screamed and screamed. Their echoing cries woke the witch herself, who rose from her bed in the nightgown, flowing like a specter. The space on her shoulders where the heads would be is utterly vacant. The headless figure stumbling towards the young girl, arms outstretched while her head screamed in a terrible illusion. We'd been in the city for a year. I'd been enrolled into a new school. It was far larger than I was accustomed to, and some of the boys at the start of the year had been brutally mocking. I was labeled as farm boy and treated as an outsider. Over the course of months, though, they had forgotten about my difference, and soon I was simply one of the other school kids. I'd seen him in the schoolyard. I didn't know his name, but he was a bright kid with a splash of sunlight blonde hair. I think he must have been about 11 years old, but much to my young eyes, he could have been older by an infinite number of years. He was a big kid. As a big kid, I tried to avoid him, because he and his friends were lauded up boisterous. He was in the upper years of high school, and as a result, he didn't have to wear his uniform. None of the upper years did, and so the big kid would wear whatever he wanted, usually a white t-shirt and jeans. I don't think he'd ever spoken to me. Barely even noticed him, but because of what happened, I remembered him. It was the summer. I was off school during the start of summer holidays. It could have been more than a few weeks since school had stopped, and it was one of the few more weeks before we were due to head away to seaside to spend our holiday in the sun. It was already a nice enough day. The sun was warm, and there was a cool wind in the air. My mother had taken me to the city center earlier that year. She had wanted to pick up a few items from the large post office, where packages were sorted. I was feeling rather sour, as my mother ventured out to do the daily shopping and interrupted my time of watching morning cartoons. Nevertheless, I had trudged along the promise that I'd behave. We could rent out a film from the video rental store that evening. It had been a long time since we rented out Return to Oz, and the film had faded from my memory. I was excited and keen to see what we could find in the dark little video rental store. My mother, was already certain that she wanted to rent out the Judy Garland musical version of The Wizard of Oz to relive her love of the classic. This was years before Blockbuster came in here to England. I had a video rental stores that were still small line stores owned by enterprising individuals looking to break a new market. My mother parked the car just a few yards from the store, and we got out. The wind was starting to pick up, and it was starting to feel a little cold. I grabbed my coat from the back seat of the car and put it on. My mother looked over at me and said, "I'm going to pop into the bakery for a moment." The bakery, I should mention, was on the street corner, 2 stores from the video rental shop, with a small barber shop between the two. "Wait here," she indicated to the front of the video store. I waited. I wasn't going to argue. I certainly wasn't going to disobey. The promise of watching a new film that evening was enough to ensure that. I had waited for what felt like an age, but I'm pretty sure there was no more than a minute when I heard the shouts from the other side of the street. I looked over. It was the big kid, in his white t-shirt and jeans, his bright blonde hair shining especially bright in the summer sun. He was on his bicycle, along with the 3 other kids. I recognized all of them from school, but it was just like the big kid. I didn't know their names, but they were shouting to each other, circling around on their bikes, doing small tricks. One of the big kid's friends would make his bike hop back and forth. Another did a swervy on his front wheel, standing up on the pedals. The road was quiet. After about a minute, the group moved to the road, riding around the parked cars. It was a peaceful morning at about 11 o'clock, and the boys were cheering. One of them made his bike hop up onto the pavement, spinning at the handlebars around as he could. Not a single other sound broke the summer day. I watched the big kid and his friend doing their tricks for a moment, and then turned to look at the window of the video rental store. The window was full of posters, and I was curious to see what films they were advertising. I looked from one to another, barely noticing when the sunlight dimmed and what a cloud passed through the sun. The slight brush of wind felt a bit colder, so I wrapped my arms around myself and waited for my mother, when I heard one of the big kid's friends cry out. The truck must have taken a turn on the road too fast. I didn't see the turn, but when I heard the cry, I looked to see it tearing down the road. It was a huge truck, massive, towering and ferocious. Its carnage smashed into one of the cars on the far side of the road. The boys in the street started to turn and run. Panic in their steps, one dropped his bike and ran on his feet instead, the scream of the truck's brakes suffocating its own scream. The big kid didn't move. I didn't know why he didn't move at the time. I realized that he was rooted to his spot by fear. His shirt whistled around him and he stared at the truck, eyes wide, mouth open, a scream echoing from his mouth. He tried to raise his hands to cover his face, as if thin arms would defend him from the monophonic 10-wheeled truck that was charging out of control towards him. He was screaming and screaming and screaming. The truck bore down the street, and even though it was almost 30 foot from where I was standing, I felt the air hit me in a hard gust as it charged down the big kid. The truck didn't even collide with him. It simply poured over for where he stood, his body buckling underneath it, folding it like it was made of paper. His head at the height of the top of the wheels. It tore his foot free. There wasn't much blood, but the force of the truck was colliding with the big kid, ripped the boy's head off from his shoulders, and sent it hurtling across the road. The big kid's head struck the road. It suddenly was nothing more than a hunk of meat, like a prop in a movie. I wasn't screaming. I couldn't. My throat couldn't make any sound, except for a series of wheezing gasps. I tried to pull enough air into my lungs. I couldn't scream because I couldn't breathe, but there was screaming in the air, and I couldn't figure out who was screaming. Then I realized it was the head, the big kid's head, swaying slightly as it laid on the side of the road, in the gutter, emptying its last sounds from the runs of its throat. An awful scream that rattled from the severed neck just for a few short seconds. The truck had stopped where it was, its brakes bringing to a stop all too late. but beneath its wheels, the big kid's body twitched for a few moments more, his arms playing out the last moments of his muscle memory as he tries to feel around in the empty air above his shoulders. The witch kept a collection of heads. She had changed them and would wear a different one depending on her mood. And after a few short, terrible seconds, the movement ceased and the screaming stopped. The big kid, who had less than a minute before been a living person, was rendered into pieces by unmoving matter, human meat broken apart and empty. My mother ran from the bakery over to me and pulled me out of the way, hoping that moving me out of the scene would push what I had seen from my mind. But it wouldn't work. I closed my eyes, but the image didn't go away. I could still see the big kid's head and the side of his face ripped and caved inwards like a dessert bowl, his eyes in the wrong place, and his mouth was open as he felt the last echoes of his scream. Dorothy, of course, had fled from the witch's twitching, lurching body and her collection of screeching heads. She had run away and escaped the horrors. I wasn't quite so lucky. Some things I couldn't escape from. They would hold me in place and exist in the space between the blinking of my eyes. With the powder of life, Dorothy was able to grow together a mass of assorted items in the witch's tower. A sofa and a moose's head and the other random junk brought to life, creating an assortment of mishmash of a creature. It was called Gump, and like Jack Pumpkinhead, it was a jumble of homunculus of items. Dorothy flew away on the winged Gump, flying across the Deadly Desert. The Deadly Desert is a mass of sand at the border of Oz, which if you so much touch the sand, it would cause you to turn into sand yourself. Several of the wheelers pursued Dorothy, and then when their wheels touched the sand, they collapsed. Their bodies yellowed, cracked, and fell apart, their bodies shifting into this wind, the lines and curves of their faces shattering and breaking apart. The Gump rips apart in the air, its wings breaking, and Dorothy and her friends crash land into the mountain of the Gnome King, a sinister creature formed of living rock. The Gnome King was played by an Austrian with a stern decorum by Nicole Williamson, a Scottish actor who forged his way through many respective Shakespeare roles on stage and screen before his death in 2011. Williamson also played the doctor from the hospital back in Kansas, that both to take the sinister doctor and his beastly assistant that had been incarnated in Oz. Actors and all makes me all the more sure that the dark and sinister Oz of this film, but in a flash, is Dorothy's memory as she drowns in the river during that storm. No, she doesn't drown. No matter how many times I tried to remind myself of the story, I kept thinking that she drowned. I've seen the film so many times as an adult, and yet each time I watched it, I find myself thinking that she falls into the churning waters of the river. It's here at this point that she drowns. I know my cautious mind that she doesn't, but each time I think back on this film, I remember Dorothy slipping beneath the thrashing waves of her skin, wet and cold, gasping for air, drowning beneath the weight of her water. No, Dorothy does not drown. That's not the story in the film. I kept remembering the film differently. I kept thinking that she drowns, but she doesn't. She doesn't drown. Dorothy does not drown. She goes to Oz and rescues her friends who have been captured by the Gnome King. She goes into the Gnome King's treasure chamber, where she has turned all of her friends into ornaments. She brings them back to life. The little Faruza, bulk in her first film role, she didn't drown. She went on to be Stacy in America History X. She didn't drown. She brings them all back to Emerald City and the Gnome King. The Gnome King dies. The evil witch Mombi is then captured by the heroes, but the Gnome King dies. Dorothy's companion, the talking chicken called Belina, drops an egg into the Gnome King's mouth. The Gnome King at this point was having become a gigantic creation of living rock, gags and chokes as he raps the words, "Eggs! Poison!" and crumbles. His entire body breaks apart, slowly chunks of rock falling away, taking his face with it. Eggs. Poison. Eggs, of course, are not poison. In the film, they're only poisonous to the Gnome King. I never understood why, and when I was a child, I didn't even realize it was a condition purely to the Gnome King, and not something that would affect any other characters, human or otherwise. The statement was simply a proclamation, a warning. Eggs, poison. Wizard, his face turned the rock, churned and boiled and fell apart like pebbles. Poison. My mother served me a plate of scrambled eggs for lunch. This was at least 2 weeks before we moved to the city, away from our village home. I had lived in a small village for my entire life. We had no more than 30 buildings and a single main street with its local shop, pub, schoolhouse, and church. Surrounded as we were by farmland, a large number of our local produce was agricultural. Local beef, pork, eggs. I pushed the plate away. Not hungry? Asked my mother. I shook my head. Poison. I found the nest during the summer. It was hidden in the roots of an old oak tree, near the back of the church hall. It had been built by some of the stray chickens who had nestled down amongst the gnarled and twisted roots of the rotting tree. I found it one morning, whizzed on my way to school. It had been raining the night before, and my rubber Wellington boots were fleckled with mud. It was the sound of head first, a bleating cry. I stepped through the soggy grass and leaned closer, peering through the shadows of the old tree roots. The nest was wet and full of dirt. 2 chicken eggs sat in the dirt, and their surfaces glistening from the rain. The third egg lay in place. Bits of its shell hung like a deflated balloon. The infant chicken had been born too early. It was premature and half-formed. Its body looked like a wet mess of string. Its skin was oily and black, and seemed to be made out of muscle fiber. Its head was too big for its neck, and it hung limply on one side. Its eyes opened too far wide, and its twitching as if on string, trying to breathe, struggling to live. The rest of it was only partly there. It was a premature birth, the fetus of a creature, more muscle than tissue ever in life. Its head had cracked and spilled of chick into the world, rejecting it. Poison. We didn't have a cafeteria in our school. It was too small of a building. Instead, the local store would send a van to the back of the schoolhouse, where the teachers would collect our meals and bring them to the gym hall, which was also doubled as the auditorium. Despite it being significantly too small to qualify as one, we sat and ate our lunches. Those who got our lunches from the school van, and those who had brought the packed lunch together. My mother had made some ham sandwiches, with the crusts cut neatly off. I sat there with 3 other kids from my class. Chris was a keen football fan, and would usually rush through his lunch in order to finish early so he can hurry into the yard and kick a ball around for a while. Josh was quiet, bookish sort, who had long black hair and a set of strong braces, and each shown time he smiled. And when there was Gary, who didn't speak much, but followed the rest of us around quite eagerly. I chewed on my sandwich for a while, not really speaking. Chris was talking eagerly about the football match that he had been watched on television last night. I didn't care about football. His descriptions of kicks and goals seemed to almost be like alien language to me. He took a bite out of his sandwich and continued to talk, spraying bits of food as he did so. I turned to Josh, wanting to tell him about the rest of the nest I found. I told him about the chick laying squirmily in the muddy ground, gasping for life. Josh shook his head. All chickens are little when they're born, he said. I tried to explain that it was simply a baby chick, that it was half-formed and dying. But I was the only child, and wouldn't form the description properly. At best, I could explain that it had been born wrong. Chris took another bite out of his sandwich, and made him have a coughing, soft sound. Josh said that maybe a fox had found the nest and was eating some of the eggs, and that maybe it had left the dead chick behind. I tried to explain to him that this might be possible. When Chris coughed again, I turned to look at him. His face looked wrong, brighter and puffier. He coughed again and again, louder, and began to motion towards his throat. A few other kids nearby turned to notice. As Chris' coughing became more insistent, he dropped his sandwich, the one he got from his lunch in the van. It fell open, slices of bread separating two to show the creamy white shade of its contents. Egg mayonnaise. Chris had tried to stand up, but he couldn't. Tripping as he did so, Josh rushed forward, trying to slap him off the back. "Help!" he shouted. Chris was clasping his throat now. His face was flushing from a pale red to a deeper, more blood-like shade. He was growing frantic and began to panic. He was wheezing for air and his breath trying to desperately fill his lungs. But he couldn't. And without any air he could drown, choke to death. But it wasn't right, and that wasn't what's killing him. I knew what was killing him. It was the poison. The eggs in the sandwich. The teacher was running over, but Chris had fallen to the floor at this point, his rasping gasps for air filling the small hall. He twitched, thrashing in the air, his skin turning darker shade of red, and I thought about the chick, which was lying doing the very same thing. I grabbed the teacher's arm. "It's the eggs," I said instantly, my eyes stinging as I felt tears with them. "The eggs, they're poisoned." Chris was taken to the local doctor clinic, where they found the obstruction of his throat, a large piece of eggshell, almost the size of a small coin, which had burrowed its sharp edge into the side of his throat. I don't think the film is cursed. The whole cursed movie thing does not work. Not in reality. It may have been the director's only movie, but that doesn't mean anything about it was unusual. I don't think the video I watched was haunted. No, this definitely wasn't the movie that haunted. It was me. By the time she goes back to Kansas, Dorothy's journey is over. She has found the rightful heir to the throne of Oz and helped her reclaim her world. We learned that the hospital burned to the ground during the storm. The doctor died in the fire, burned to death. The Gnome King died, and so did the doctor. Both characters, both played by the same actor, met the same fate. But Dorothy was home, and she was wiser and more confident now. Her sadness was gone, and she could carry the memory of Oz with her forever. I wonder if that was her curse as well, that poor little Dorothy Gale would forever return to Oz. I stood on the road where the truck had struck and killed the blonde-haired kid. This was about a month ago. I was in the city for business, and I had just finished a new project, the shooting of a new film. When I was 12, I watched a movie called Cinema Paradiso, a classic modern Italian movies. It follows the story of a man who grows up in a small village to who the local cinema has a major impact on his life. He goes to grow up and becomes a respected film director. There are similarities between our lives, and when I had finished my 5th feature film, I would begin to wonder just what kind of an influence the films I had watched as a child had to be. How they had shaped me into who I was. The character in Cinema Paradiso is bolstered by these. They gave him strength and a means of escape. For me, there was one film that terrified me, and that's what brought me back to the streets where the big kid had died in the truck accident. It was only a coincidence that had brought me here. I had 2 weeks to go and editing would begin on the film. I needed a break, a way to clear my head. The editing was due to take one place to the main studio. Out by this sheer coincidence, my hotel wasn't too far from where the truck accident had occurred. That evening, I walked to the streets and I thought it would maybe look the same. I didn't really know what I hoped to find. I didn't want to drown out my memories. Maybe I just wanted to see them one last time, in order to say goodbye. The video rental store was long since gone. The bakery was still there though. The young man behind the counter told me that he couldn't remember a video rental store being there on the street ever since he had moved to the city. Some 7 years ago, time had changed. I still hadn't expected to still see the marks of the tires from that truck on the road. I didn't. No black scorch burned of rubber, and no dash of blood in the gutter where the head had landed. The city had changed. It had moved on. Only my memory remained. There was one last place I had to go. My hometown village in Cornwall had changed, perhaps more drastically. I drove there in my white sedan, and when I pulled up to the village's main street, I realized that time had gone ravaging the place far worse than any hurricane could. I was determined not to let the weight of my dissuade me from what I intended to do. Though I parked my car and looked around. I tasted the air and I looked around. I had drove through the smooth hills, which were once full of wheat, but now were empty. My Kansas was gone. The air tasted different. This, I thought, was my own return to Oz. The The post office was shut and had closed many years before. The small corner shop was still a Safeway, and even so it was a small one, with only a single checkout. I went to the local pub, which I had never done when I was a child there. The man behind the bar barely took notice of me. All around me the people seemed old, as if the history had chewed on them and left their wrinkled faces gaunt. I didn't see any children there. The bartender told me that there weren't really any young families around here anymore. No work around here, it seemed. Only the old people that had once worked on the farms, waiting for the dust of the earth to reclaim them. Being in the village was painful. I felt like a relic, something in the past I had forgotten. Time had moved on. I had moved on. The village had not. It had struggled. It had lost. I didn't want to stay for too long, and I knew I wanted to make this quick before being here became too painful. Before the ghosts of my memories began to hurt me, I left the pub and started on my walk. The school was the closest, so I went there first. It was a poor decision. The building itself was barren. The sign at the front with the school's name had once been boldly etched onto it, had been taken down. The building was abandoned, without the children to teach. There was no use of the school anymore. I learned from the man who owned the local pub that the hall where Chris had choked on the broken piece of eggshell so many years before was still occasionally used for village meetings, but the classrooms had long since been abandoned. I walked around the building, peering into the rooms. They were all bare and emptied of furniture. No desks, no chairs. One had held an old blackboard, its surface covered with dust. When I got to the church, I realized before I stepped into the yard that the old oak tree was long gone. I found an old priest with a shock dirty white hair trending to the front of the church. When I asked him about the tree, he told me that it had caught on disease several years before it was cut down. I walked into the yard and sure enough, found the old dry patch of the ground where the tree once stood. The ground felt harder than the soil surrounding it and rose in a steady lump, like a despoiled grave. The old farmhouse had been demolished. It had been concreted over, as if no prevent anyone else from building there. At the foot of the hill, a large square patch of gray concrete was almost lost amongst the tall grass. I almost stumbled across it because the years had pushed the details of the location from my mind. When I found the patch of concrete, I have expected to find the small plague as well. Perhaps an indication to the 4 children who had been murdered and buried here. There wasn't one. The concrete itself was just cracked and old by then, with bits of weeds and long grass peeking its way through like nature's own fingertips. It was almost, I thought, like the world wants to forget. I felt tired. The journey had been pained, bittersweet. I felt that I had made my homecoming, and felt the sadness that it would bring. I wanted to leave soon. The memories were too strong, the ones that were so powerful for me, but the rest of the world had done its best to forget. I had made my journey, or so I thought, but I wasn't yet done. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached the river. I didn't know what brought me here. I had no idea what guided my steps. I'd forgotten that village had a river. In the daylight, I thought the river might look beautiful, but with the sun starting to dye the sky red, slip down towards the horizon, made the undercurrents of the water look dark. My feet had brought me here, almost unbidden, as if it was following a trail that was laid out for me long ago. This is where my broken, ruined yellow brick road leads me. And that's when I remembered. This is where she drowned. I don't remember it all at once. The images came in first. Her face and her eyes wide in terror, the water splashing over her skin, making it glisten. Her mouth full and unable to take enough air. Her short black hair slick against her scalp in utter disarray. The water kept washing over her face, the dark cloak of her current covering her for a few fleeting moments before she broke the surface again, only to dip back into the icy embrace again. I was on the bank of the river. I was clasping into her arm, but it was so cold on a winter's night, and her coat was too wet. I was wearing gloves and she kept slipping. I couldn't hold on. I couldn't get a good grip. I wasn't strong enough. I was only 6 years old and she was 4, and the river had her. The river held her in her grasps as the water was like fingers, and it had been a better grip on her than I ever could. She was crying, shouting for me to help. The water was weighing her down and stopping her words from escaping. She was drowning, and I was panicking. I was meant to look after her. She was my sister, and I was her big brother. I was meant to protect her. I was meant to look after her. And she was drowning. She had fallen in and hit the water with a splash, and that splash was so loud that I had broken the world. And I had forgotten. Maybe not forgotten. I think my mind just forced that memory out. It's new. I couldn't cope with it. Not when I was just a little boy. I remember my parents and their tears, and the ambulance that called my parents telling me over and over that it wasn't my fault. But it was. I was still that little boy who made himself forget that he was standing on the riverbank, clutching onto the girl's arm as she was drowning. This I realized. This is why I had come here. I needed to make myself remember. I had to find the source of my fear. Remember what it was that had kept this moment from my mind. She drowned in the river. She drowned. I hadn't remembered it. I made myself forget, and that memory had seeped into the movie. That I realized it was my secret. I kept it all locked up inside me, but the memory had found a way. My little sister's ghost wouldn't be forgotten. Each time I had thought of that damnable movie, each time I tried to remember Return to Oz, I remembered Dorothy Gale drowning in the river, but it wasn't Dorothy. It had never been Dorothy. It had been my little sister. She was a ghost, not by some sinister, sulking figure that thirsted for revenge, but she had always been there, always in my shadows, haunting me, until I made my own journey into the past and made my own return to Oz. That film was important to me. I knew it now. I had never been free from it, but even when I tried to say goodbye, when I spoke my lost little sister's name on the riverbank, I knew she would follow me forever. I couldn't leave her behind. I couldn't lock her away again. Return to Oz bound us together forever. Because my mother, who had loved Judy Garland, had named my sister Dorothy.
What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.